Thank you everyone for coming this afternoon. Unfortunately, earlier this week, Diane fell ill, so she wasn't able to be here in person. But thankfully, to some Zoom technology, we're able to video her in for you guys. We have people in the Zoom online chat watching, and you guys here in presence. Diane is the Tribal Historical Preservation Officer for the Myaami Nation. She lives in Fort Wayne, and she's got close connections to the Marion Public Library. She used to come here as a child, and she's a good friend of ours. So we're hoping that she can enlighten us more on the culture and lifestyles of the Myaami people who are still an active community today, and their history here in Indiana as the indigenous people here. Take it away, Diane.
Aya, te pewene o la kakoke o wahanungi kakikwe. Checha kokwa Waynes Viane, nilamita senia Myaamiaki, seka kweta nehepalanzwa alapakasiane. I just introduced myself to you in Myaamiaki Wenge, the Miami language, and I pretty much said what Colin just said to you. I will add that I am a citizen of the Miami tribe of Oklahoma, and I am a descendant of Seka Kweta and Palanzwa, who are also known as the Godfroys. And I am honored to serve my nation as Tribal Historic Preservation Officer. As Colin alluded to a moment ago, I will say to you what I don't usually say in my talks, and that is that I grew up just down the road in the town of LaFountain. So Marion is a very familiar place to me. What I'd like to do today is to focus on the life of Miami people before our contact with Europeans and in those first centuries after contact. We'll talk about the lives of men and women, about our homes, about our calendar, and about our entertainment. So I like to begin at the beginning. Mitame Myaamiaki Nipangonje Sakachawe Chike. At first, the Miami came out of the water. Now that's the first line of our oldest story. It's the story of our emergence as a unique and different people. The place where we came out of the water, we called Sakiweonge. And you can see it on the map. I hope you can see my pointer here, up near Lake Michigan, Sakiweonge. And we don't know exactly where Sakiweonge was, but we know that it was on the St. Joseph River, not the St. Joseph River that goes through Fort Wayne, but the St. Joseph River that goes around South Bend. And somewhere between South Bend and Lake Michigan is where Sakiweonge was, where we came out of the water. And so the St. Joseph River is the water that we came out of. So Miami people have lived in and around Indiana since time immemorial. Now the map I show you here is a map of Myaamiaki, the land of the Miami, and this is our historic ancestral homelands. And you can place yourselves on that map. Probably closest for you is Kikayonga. Perhaps you are familiar with Fort Wayne and have heard it called, they pronounce it a little differently, but Kikayonga was one of our large villages, and today it is Fort Wayne. So you can place yourselves pretty close on this map. These are not all of our villages, but they are our largest villages that we are aware of today, and we know where they are. So we lived in this area, as I said, since time immemorial. Most of our villages, as you can see, were in the Wabash River Valley. But we had what is now Fort Wayne. We even had a number of villages over in what is now Western Ohio. So I want to talk a little bit about what life in these villages was like. Now, the men and women had very distinctive roles to make our community function. Men and women had things that needed to be done by them. So the men's roles were pretty much outside the village. The men did the hunting and the fishing. The men did the trading. So when we didn't have enough of something, the men would go to another village or another tribe and exchange something that we have in excess of for something that we needed and they had in excess of. And that was the men's role. When I talk to children, I tell them that the men did the shopping. The men also were the ones to make war, and they were the ones to make peace. And to do that, in addition to our civil chief, we also always had a war chief. But you can see that the men were pretty much outside the village. All of these things, the hunting, the fishing, the trading, the making war, and the making peace, all occurred away from our villages. So how do our villages function? Well, of course, it's the women who are running the villages, the women who are making sure that everything happens at home that needs to happen. And to do that, we also had a female chief and a female war chief. And so the male chiefs and the female chiefs would work together in council to make decisions for our people. But I will say that they were not the kind of leaders who ruled it over us. They were servant leaders. So their role was to do the will of the people. The women chiefs came to council to represent the women of the village and what the women of the village wanted. And the men, the male chiefs, would represent the wills of the men, and they would bring that together in council. Now, the women built our homes. The typical kind of home we call a Myaamiaki. In English, we often say wigwam. And it was made with saplings of trees that would be bent into an arc, but into a dome kind of shape. And then the women would sew cattail reeds together into mats. And those mats formed the outside, the walls of the house. And sometimes we also had inundewe, a long house. It would be used if a family was particularly large. They might need something larger than a Myaamiaki, and you can't make those domes very big, so it would be an elongated kind of structure. The longhouse would also be used for council meetings in the cold of winters, so that they had a place to meet where it wasn't quite so cold. So women made our houses, and therefore women owned our houses. If anything happened within the family, it was the man who had to leave, not the woman. But the women made all the things we needed. Our clothes, our dishes, the pottery, everything that our community needed was made by the women, using often things that the men would bring home from hunting, fishing, trading. But the women would then make them into objects or things that we needed. Our women were also our farmers. We have a specific Miami corn called minjipe. You're in corn country and you know about corn, but this is a particular variety of corn. It's an 8-row white corn. And so the women were the farmers and would grow the cornfields with the help of the children. The children were with their mothers, helping in all of these things until the boys got old enough to go with the men. We also had gardens. The cornfield was generally one cornfield for the entire village. So you can imagine they were very large cornfields. But then each family would have a garden with beans, squash, melon, and other things that we wanted to grow. But we also used those things that came in the wild, those things that grew naturally. We gathered roots and lily pads, and especially milkweed. Excuse me. I still remember my grandmother, when she would drive home from our house. She lived in Peru and we lived in La Fountain, and the drive along the way, if she saw milkweed along the side of the road, she would pull her car over to the side and gather some milkweed leaves and take them home to cook and eat. So milkweed has been a favorite for many, many years. But then the women also, of course, then after gathering and growing the food, the women would also prepare the food. So men and women had very defined roles in the community. But unlike what we've seen in our Euro-American culture, there was no sense that anyone's work was more important than anyone else's. We recognized that the work that the men did was vital to us, and that the work of the women was vital to us if we were going to thrive, if we were going to survive. We needed all of that work, and we recognized that and did not see any work as more important to our lives than anything else. Another activity that took place on an annual basis was our winter hunting. So families would travel to hunt bison and other large game. There weren't a lot of bison in this area, in the northern Indiana area. So we would travel to what is now southern Indiana and west into what is now Illinois to hunt bison, and whole families would go. We would take the cattail mats with us so that all we had to do was put up a frame, and we could put the cattails around, and there we've got a house wherever we go. Now, in late winter, it was time for maple sugaring. Now, some of you may have done, maybe you do regularly go out for maple sugaring, but in case you aren't familiar, I'll tell you a little bit about maple sugaring and then talk about how it fit into our lives. So maple sugaring is taking the sap from trees, eliminating the water until you end up with sugar crystals. It occurs in that period at the end of winter, Pepunwe, as we would call it, during that time when it still freezes at night, but in the day it's around 40 degrees. And that's usually in February or early March. Sometimes it can extend into April. In fact, this year, I heard some people thinking that they were going to go maple sugaring even as early as January. We've had some strange weather this year. But it's all about timing. If you do it too early, there's no sap. If you try it too late, then the sap tastes bitter. So why was maple sugaring important to us? It's about this time of year our supplies of fruits and vegetables have really diminished. The availability of big game is less at this time. So sugar was a really calorie boost at a time when we really needed that. It was a useful trade item. Sugar maples only extend in a certain area, and we'll look at that later. So we could trade it to tribes that did not have easy access to sugar maple trees. And it just tastes good. So we liked that. So it took preparation to go maple sugaring. Of course, we had to gather all the tools that we needed for the task itself. But we were going to be away from home for quite a while. So we needed to pack things for ourselves, clothing, blankets, food. And then we would go out into the woods. And the first thing that needed to happen was we've got to get a fire going, because we're going to need a fire going the entire time we're doing this, for warmth, but also for the processing that we're going to do of the sap. So that was a great task for the children. Send them out to gather firewood. So while they're doing that, the women would insert spiles into the maple sugar trees. Now, we would go to the same place every year, someplace where there's a large number of maple sugar trees, often called a sugar bush. And so it would be a large number of women and children in that group that would come together to do that. So the women are cutting into the tree with a spile, something that we'll cut into, and the sap will run down the spile into containers to catch the sap. And then those containers would be emptied into larger containers. And when those containers got bigger, we would put them in even larger containers at the fire. Now, it was the elder women's job to tend the fire and to keep it stirring all the time as that sap burns down into a maple syrup. But the elder women had another important role, and that came at night. Now, once it got dark, the temperature dropped, and it was too cold for the sap to run. So it was a time for us to rest, and it was a time for the elder women to tell us stories. Now, many of our stories can only be told in the wintertime. Well, this would still be wintertime, and so these women would be telling stories that they had heard from their parents and their grandparents, who heard it from their grandparents, and had been passed on for generations and generations. The children would hear the same stories every year, over and over again, and delighted in hearing those stories. And we still have some of those stories in our community today. Now, as the sap burns down into syrup, it was time we could have a treat. You pour the hot syrup onto the snow, what do you get? Maple candy. So that was really, really good. We also would pour the syrup onto cornbread, and that was also a treat there. So we couldn't preserve the syrup. We didn't have the ways of preserving it for very long, so we needed to make it into sugar. So you keep boiling out the water until it becomes a thick paste. And that paste is then put into these wooden troughs, as you see in the picture there. And the women stir and grind that paste until it granulates and becomes sugar. Then the sugar is pressed into molds. Sometimes they're molds that we carved ourselves, and you can see at the bottom of the screen there an example of a sugar mold. Sometimes we made cones out of bark, and the sugar would be packed into that, and you can see that at the top. And we wanted to keep the sugar cold because it's cold, it gets hard, and it keeps a long time. And we'd keep even longer if we would just bury it into the cold ground. So we're doing this over a period of sometimes weeks, depending on how the seasons were. But when we were finished, it was time to quit. And that's when it was no longer freezing at night. When it's so warm that we don't have freezing nights, then the sap stops running and it's time to go home. So we gather everything up, we wash ourselves, which, as you can imagine, we were probably pretty sticky by this time with all the sap and the syrup and the sugar. So we would wash up and pack up and head home. Now, this is something that we have done in what is now Indiana since time immemorial. But it's something that I want to use as an example of what happened when our tribe was forcibly removed from Indiana. In 1846, we were forcibly removed west of the Mississippi to what is now eastern Kansas. And 20 years after that, we were removed a second time into northeastern Oklahoma, which is where the tribe is headquartered today. So I'm going to show you this map. If you look at the map on, I believe it'll be on your left, this shows the range of sugar maple trees, where sugar maple naturally grows. And you can see, well, Indiana, yeah, we've got lots and lots of sugar maples, we always have. But if you go to eastern Kansas, just in the very eastern part of the state, what is now the state of Kansas, we find sugar maples naturally growing. So when we were forced to live out there, there was one sugar bush on the eastern edge of our reservation, and that was it. And then when we went south to northeastern Oklahoma, you can see there are no sugar maples there. Now you can get sap from any kind of maple tree, and even some other kinds of trees, birch and box elder trees. You can get sap. And here you can see this is the range of silver maple trees. And they do extend into further into Kansas and into eastern Oklahoma. But yes, you can get sap, but it's not as sweet. You can't get as much sugar. So you have to do a lot more tapping of trees to get a lot less sugar. So this became less viable as a source of sugar for us. And in fact, we started having to buy sugar once we were in Kansas and Oklahoma, because we didn't have enough sugar maple trees to supply what we needed. Now, more and more Myaamiaki and Miami people are learning to do sugaring today. The timing isn't always the same. We know that our climate is a little different than it was 200 years ago, but there's still that period where we can go sugaring, and more Miami people are doing that. And more people generally are doing sugaring. So the timing of ecological events like the weather affecting when we can go sugaring impacted our lives greatly, so much that we use our calendar based on ecological events. So our Miami calendar is a lunar calendar. A Gregorian calendar that we're all familiar with is based on the sun, but our calendar, our Myaami calendar, is based on the moon. Each month is based on the phases of the moon, and the months are alternately 29 or 30 days. And what's particularly interesting, I think, is that each month focuses on what's happening in our environment, what's changing in our environment at this particular time. So I'd like to take a look at our calendar and talk about how the ecological environment was important to Miami people, and still is. Excuse me. Now we are currently in Makunza Kilswa, the young bear moon. And what you see on the left here in the center, I guess, is images from our current year calendar. And then I've put in images of how that is tied to the ecology. So the young bear moon, this is the first of our calendar. And so right here, the first of young bear moon is New Year's Day. And we do celebrate that. But if you notice at the bottom, we also put the Gregorian date. So our New Year's Day this year was February 22nd on the Gregorian calendar. And so we do that. We put in our Myaami month dates, but we also put in the Gregorian calendar because that's what we're all used to, and it helps us to figure out what date we are really on. Now, this is called the young bear moon, Makunza Kilswa, because this is the time when the American black bear cubs are starting to emerge from their dens. This is also the month when maple sugaring often will begin, at least in some years that happens. And you can see here we are right here. March 11th is the 18th day of Makunza Kilswa. And in Oklahoma, they are having a language day. The next month will be Andekwa Kilswa, crow moon. And crow usually nests and breeds during this month. And in fact, the American crow is usually the first to build nests and lay eggs in this part of the country. And this typically occurs in that period, excuse me. I'm sorry. In that period, in the transition between Pipunwe, winter, and Nipinwe, summer. We only have 2 seasons, summer and winter. And then we have transition periods where you would normally think it was spring or fall. By the end of Andekwa Kilswa, the sugar maples have started to bud, and the sugaring season certainly will have come to an end. This is then followed by Chechakwa Kilswa, the sandhill crane moon. This is also still in that transition period from Pinpunwe winter to Nipinwe summer. And it's when the sandhill cranes have returned from their winter nesting in Florida. Now, historically, sandhill cranes nested in many places in the Wabash River Valley and in places throughout the Midwest. And if you want to see sandhill cranes, there are many places to go. The Jasper Pulaski Nature Preserve has thousands during that transition period. And I'm told that even the Pokagon State Park in northeastern Indiana has some sandhill cranes, particularly in the late fall when they are going south. But Chechakwa, the sandhill crane, is closely associated with Myaami people. The Delaware and various Iroquois-speaking people referred to Myaami as the Twaitwi after that call of the sandhill crane. And there are many, many stories about our connection with the sandhill crane, and it is a symbol on our tribal symbol and on our tribal flag. We have an image of the sandhill crane today. Next comes Wikuya Kilswa, whippoorwill moon. And this also is when the whippoorwills return from their winter nesting grounds around the Gulf of Mexico. And historically, they also were along the Wabash River Valley, but there have been such drastic changes in the forest habitat that we don't see nearly as many Wikuya as we did in central Indiana today. But the call of the Wikuya is distinctive. And when we heard that, we knew it was time to start planting corn, or minjipe. Now we're into summer, and it's Papsaka Nipinwiki, midsummer moon. Now, our planting is done by this time. It's not time for harvest, so it's a downtime agriculturally. And so we're going to fill this time with games and dancing and social gatherings. It's a fun time, kind of summer vacation, right? That we do even today. But in Papsaka Nipinwike, we also find Pasakakanga, the summer solstice. And as we know, the summer solstice is the longest day of the year. And that marks the center of summer. And for us, it marks the anchor point of our lunar calendar. And I'll talk more about that in a little bit. As we move further into summer, we come to Kishingwea Kilswa, green corn moon. So if our minjipe, our corn, was planted in Wikuwea Kilswa, in the whippoorwill moon, when we heard the whippoorwills, we planted the corn like we're supposed to. During this stage, the corn reaches the milk stage, and it can be eaten raw off the cob. Now, after this stage, the kernels become dense and hard, as we're familiar, and it requires processing before it can be eaten. But at this point, we can eat it right off the cob. And so this is a time for celebration and feasting, because not only is the corn ready to eat, but a lot of our other fruits and vegetables are ripening during this month. So it's a great time to eat a lot. Next comes Mishiwea Kilswa, the elk moon. And this refers to the eastern red elk, which I am sorry to tell you is extinct. When we had eastern red elk, it was what we could hear them bugling at this time of year. They were bugling to attract the females and to ward off other males. So you may see places around here now that have elk, and those are generally western red elk that have been brought in. It's a different species, but very similar to the eastern red elk. There's a place here in Fort Wayne called the LC Nature Park, and they have bison and elk. And I was out there a couple of years ago in August, and we could hear the elk bugling. And of course, it was Mishiwea Kilswa. So the timing was just perfect. That's the time to hear the elk bugling. As we go into the fall, we have Shashakaolea Kilswa, the grass burning moon. Now, at the end of the summer, the forest understory and the prairie grasses have started to dry out, and we would have controlled burns. And indigenous people around North America have used fire as a tool to shape our environment since time immemorial. We would control these fires. It would make the land more habitable for us, and it would encourage the growth of those plants that we needed and discourage the growth of those plants that were less important to us. The next month is Keolea Kilswa, smoky burning moon. So this month it's actually 2 months of burning. And some of that had to do with what's going on in the environment, how much rain have we had, but it's during those 2 months that we're doing these controlled burns. That's followed by Ayapenza Kilswa, the young buck moon, and that refers to the white-tailed deer, as you can see there. And this month is marked by the beginning of the rut, the breeding cycle for the white-tailed deer. And it's followed then by buck moon, Ayapia Kilswa. And this is the time when the young white-tailed deer bucks would drop their antlers. The young ones dropped them first, and that loss of the antlers meant the end of the rut for these younger male deer. And finally, we get to the end of the year, Makwa Kilswa, bear moon. And this is the time when the mature female bears are giving birth to their cubs. Now, bear is important to Miami people. A bear tenderloin is considered a particular delicacy. Bear fat was good for food, but for other purposes, it warded off mosquitoes. And it doesn't have a smell, so you wouldn't be smelling bad when you're walking around with bear grease to ward off the mosquitoes. So bears are really important to Miami people. And Makwa, bear, also plays a prominent role in our winter stories. We often hear the appearance of Makwa in our stories. Now, our lunar calendar, being ecologically based, means that it has to stay so that each month occurs when the ecological event occurs. But a lunar calendar, a lunar year, is 11 days shorter than a solar year. And so over time, our months begin to shift away from the indicators of their names. So today we use that Pasakakange, the summer solstice, as the indicator of when we are too far off. If that comes too far away from the summer solstice date, then we've got to make an adjustment. And to do that, we add a month. Every 3 years, approximately, we add Wawita Kilswa, the lost moon. And that happens in the dead of winter, between Makwa Kilswa, the black bear moon, and the beginning of the year, Makunza Kilswa, the young black bear moon. So everything's quiet in the winter. And so the lost moon has no ecological changes associated with it. We just insert it. We had a Wawita Kilswa this year, as you can see on the calendar here. It started January 24th and ended February 21st. And on February 22nd, as we noted before, we started our new year. And so this happens, as I say, every 3 years, and it puts everything back in alignment again. Now, I mentioned that especially during the summer, during Nipinwe, when we have these celebrations, that we like to play games. And so I'd like to talk about some of those games. One of the games that we have played since time immemorial is Pekita Hamenge. Today we would call it lacrosse. And we know that we've been playing that for a long, long time because the French traders who first appeared in the 1600s wrote about it. And I'd like to just read a quote from a trader named Nicolas Perrault from the late 1600s. And he talks about the Miami. He said, they have several kinds of games in which they take delight. They are so naturally addicted to these that they will give up their food and drink, not only to play, but to watch the game. Does that sound familiar? That's what we do today, isn't it? So we've been addicted to our games, our sports, since time immemorial. We now today have found a way to eat and drink while we watch our sports, but the importance of them goes back as far as anybody knows. But we have been playing lacrosse. We continue to play lacrosse today. And we play not like, if you're familiar with lacrosse as it's played in high schools and colleges today, that's not how we play. First of all, we today play with a traditional style stick. This looks like one of the sticks in the previous image. And one of our colleagues has learned how to make these sticks, and he's made hundreds of these so that everyone can play with them. And you can see they're playing with those sticks in this game. But we play in our own way. We play in our traditional way. Perot and others noticed that both men and women played. Now, I understand that in some tribes, women do not play, but Miami people, women have always played. So we play men and women, boys and girls, everyone together, and everyone who wants to play can play. I have seen a game with as many as 200 people on the field at one time. So we really enjoy playing. And now the young men, the teenage young men and the 20-somethings, they get pretty intense in their playing. But they also recognize that they have children. We don't have any really young children in this photo. Last summer, we had at our annual gathering, we played a game, and our youngest player was 3 years old. Our oldest player was 83. So these young men who are really into the game and pretty intense with each other, they will step back and let the little ones have a chance. And they won't try to take the ball from the little ones and let them have a turn, because that's how they're going to learn and grow up to be really good lacrosse players. I have to say these young men are not so kind to their fathers. The men that are in their 50s and 60s can sometimes get whacked pretty hard in the game because we have no rules. We try to play, we don't intentionally hurt people, but we recognize that this is a game when people get hurt. You're trying to whack somebody's stick and you accidentally whack their wrist. It happens, and we're used to that. And our children are used to that, and they step out, get a Band-Aid, and step right back in and play the game. We love this game, and we play it anytime that we can. We start playing in the springtime. When the spring peepers, the frogs, start croaking, and we've had a big thunderstorm, then we can start playing lacrosse. And we play all summer until the fall, when the spring peepers stop croaking and we have the hard frost. Then we lay down our lacrosse sticks. And that's the time when we pick up our storytelling, because they can only be told in the winter. So when the frogs stop croaking, we stop playing lacrosse, we start telling stories until the spring. The frogs start croaking, we lay down the thread of storytelling and start playing lacrosse. So it's a cycle for us. But we love playing lacrosse together. Other games that, again, were noted by Perot and others, one is Senza Wenge. It's sometimes called in English the bowl game, for obvious reasons. It's played with a bowl and dice. And you toss those dice in the bowl, and how they fall, you get points. Unfortunately, I have a picture where the person got muchakiku, no points at all. So it depends on what comes up, how many points you get, and the first person to get 10 points wins. And then the other game you see here is the moccasina game, the moccasin game. Originally was played with moccasins instead of these pads. We would have used moccasins. And it's a hide the pebble game. So one team hides the pebble under the mat, and the other team has to find it. Now, while they're trying to figure out where that pebble is hidden, the hiding team is singing something like, Kimi katulo, kimi katulo, kimi katulo, etuke. So that's supposed to confuse them, distract them, and hopefully they won't find the pebble in the right place. So both of these games we have been playing since time immemorial. We play them. These can be played all year round when we come together. We even had Makasina tournaments. The pictures are taken at our summer camp with our youth, but it's not just youth who play these games. And originally they would have been adult games. Originally they would have been gambling games. But gambling was a different thing than it is today. So if you were going to play, you would bring in something that you had extra. Maybe you had an extra pair of moccasins. Maybe you had an extra bow. You would bring that and you would lay that down as your bet. And whoever wins, it's winner take all. So all the prizes go to the winner. But gift giving is a very high value among Myaami people. So then the winner would distribute his winnings among the other players. So maybe you brought an extra pair of moccasins and come home with a new bow. But the gambling part makes it just a little more exciting, a little more fun to play. Now I mentioned storytelling. The elder women tell stories during the maple sugaring. That our season, we have a season for these winter stories. And we have gatherings in the wintertime to tell these stories. Now, the thing I want to point out here is that these storytellers are all very young. And that's not the way it should be. As I said, with the maple sugaring, it was the elder women who were telling the stories. It should be elders telling the stories. But in the 20th century, much of our language and our culture went to sleep. And my grandmother sat listening to her father tell these stories. But my father never heard the stories told. And I did not hear the stories until I was much older. So we have some lost generations with the storytelling. But now our young people are learning the stories and they're retelling those stories. And as many of you know, like I know, one day these young people will also be elders. And they'll be telling the stories to their children and the grandchildren, and all will be right again. Well, today, our lives are different than they were 400 years ago. But we are in the process of revitalizing and again incorporating traditions like maple sugaring and games and storytelling, and even our lunar calendar. We're sent a copy of that calendar to every Myaami family, and we will hang it on our wall, just like our neighbors hang their other calendars on their wall. So this is all being incorporated into our 21st century lives. I think we have some time now. If you have questions, I'd be happy to answer any questions that you have.
Thank you, Diane. We'll have questions here, and we have, if anyone in the chat has questions, submit them and we'll relay them over to Diane. Yes, Bill.
I have a question, Diane. Many years ago, when the schoolhouse was rededicated, the renovated schoolhouse out of the Indian village of the river, and it was a really wonderful occasion. But I recall the thinking of drummers that was there, and I was wondering if you could say a word or two about the Myaami tradition of drumming.
So I don't know if you heard him, Diane. Bill Munn is asking about when the schoolhouse over by Jalapa was rededicated, they had drummers there. And he was wondering if you could say more about the practice of drumming in the Myaami.
So drumming has changed over time. Traditionally, drumming would have been with small hand drums. the big drums that you probably are familiar with, that you've seen, and some Miami people do the big drums today. They're used generally at powwows. That is a more recent adaptation. The big drums were originally from the Plains tribes, but as we have adapted over the last 200 years, the powwow and other kinds of activities, often the big drum is used today, but traditionally Miami people used a hand drum, and so it would be, I don't know if you can see, that's so big, and would be, you could use a hand to beat the drum, or you might use some kind of stick, drumstick, to beat it. But that's the tradition on that.
Okay.
The chanting accompanies the drum. Are those in the Miami language? The contemporary one, or I remember that the drumming and the chant, the various chants to go with it. And would they have been using Mayan language early in the restoration process? Is that sort of, like the storytelling sort of in recovery, or is there Mayan, distinctive Mayan chant?
So he's asking when they sang the songs and chants with the drumming, I don't know what year when the schoolhouse was rededicated, but was that in the Myaami language, or was that something else that they were singing?
Unfortunately, our songs have been lost to us. They not only went to sleep, but as far as we know, they are lost. It was one of the things that were lost. However, we use songs that are used across tribes. And many of you hear is not any particular language. It's what's called vocables. They are sounds that are used, and everybody can learn them regardless of your language. And so you learn those sounds and use the vocables in the songs. We also use language. Sometimes when we dance, we do something called stomp dance, and there's no drum. There are shakers, which I'll explain if anybody's interested. But the singing for that are sometimes from other languages as well as vocables.
Okay.
But I will say we have started. Have some people who have started writing new songs in Myaamiaki in the Miami language.
That's exciting, yeah. We have a question in the chat asking, most groups have a creation story. I remember Diane saying that they emerged from the water. Is there more? Guys, could you speak more on the creation story of coming out of the water?
So that's not necessarily a creation story. Some do consider it a creation story, but many of us do not. It's our emergence as Miami people. Many of us believe, based on some of our other stories, that we came from the north. We don't know exactly where, but probably somewhere. Our language is very similar to the Cree, who live in Canada today. So probably somewhere among them. A lot of the tribes that are Great Lakes tribes came from the north and the northeast. And so we probably came at some point by water, perhaps through Lake Michigan. So when our origin story, basically we're coming from some people who perhaps we've broken away, we've left a community behind, and we find this place where we want to stop and stay on the St. Joseph River. And so that is where we come out of the water, and now we are our own people. We are no longer a part of those people that we left behind. We are our own unique people, and who came to be called Myaamiaki, or Miami people.
All right, thank you. Yes, Ruth?
What can you tell us about the Tigerina? What's happening there in Brew with the facility?
Could you repeat that?
What is happening at the Tigerina in Peru? The facility that's now the Miami Indians?
Ruth is asking about the Tiger Arena in Peru. What's happening with that?
I assume you mean the schoolhouse. That is owned by a 501c3 organization. They are, to my knowledge, Miami people. But they're not affiliated directly with the Miami tribe.
Okay. We had a question in the back as well.
Yeah, I see. Diane mentioned the name Chief John's Way, which is up in the Fountain, going Peru area. Was he a Miami Indian, associated with this area with the Nation?
Mm-hmm.
And my second question, did the Miami Nation have like written law other than people just do their position and so forth? Did they have a written or, law or,
Mm-hmm.
like we do today?
Okay. So the person in the back asked the question about the Godfrey family and their associations with the Miami Nation, and then asked if about Miami law, what Miami law looks like.
So yes, I am part of the Godfrey family, and when the tribe was forcibly removed in 1846, there were a handful of families that were exempted from removal. The Godfreys were one of those families, although Thomas Godfrey, who was my great-grandfather's brother, was on removal and died as a result of removal, and that's a story in itself. But other Godfreys later went out to the reservation in Kansas, and a couple of them went on the removal to Oklahoma. Unfortunately, they died without children, so that there weren't Godfreys, direct Godfreys. But there are people in Oklahoma who are Godfrey descendants, and some of us are still here in Indiana. In 1996, the tribe, and there's a long history behind this, which I don't have time to tell today, but in 1996, the tribe voted to amend our Constitution and allowed to be enrolled in the tribe, you have to connect to a certain role from the 19th century. And they added another role that enabled basically all of our Indiana Miami to enroll in the Miami tribe of Oklahoma. So many, if not most, Godfreys today are citizens of the Miami tribe of Oklahoma, if that answers your question. In terms of our government, yes, I just referred to our Constitution. We, in the 1930s, there was the Oklahoma Indian Welfare Act in 1936, and under that, our tribe was re-recognized by the United States government at that time then as the Miami tribe of Oklahoma. That's when the of Oklahoma was added. And we ratified our Constitution in 1939, and it's been modified a couple of times since, most specifically, as I said, in 1996. So we have a Constitution. By that Constitution, we have elected leaders. We have our chief, Douglas Langford, and a second chief, which is kind of like vice president, a secretary treasurer, and 2 council people. And they make decisions on a daily basis for us. But like their predecessors, they are servant leaders. And so it is their obligation to make decisions based on the will of Miami people. We have an annual meeting every June where we come together. We elect our leaders for 3-year periods, and they're on a rotating cycle. And so at that meeting, we elect them, and then we tell them what we want them to do. And it's their obligation to see that it happens.
Thank you. We have another question from the chat, and this we'll probably have time for one more question after that. The question in the chat is, are there any examples of Miami trade goods or the trade networks that the Miami interacted with? I assume this is before the forced displacement from Indiana. Who were some of the people that the Miami were trading with, and what were they trading with them?
We would have been trading with other villages because, as you saw from that map, we lived in a lot of villages. So they would have been trading among Miami villages, but there were also eventually the Shawnee and the Delaware had villages very close to us. So we would be trading with them. We might be trading further distances with, for example, the Wyandot, who were in what is now Ohio. And then the French appeared, and we started trading with them and got some really cool new stuff that we had never had, like metal pots and other kinds of European manufactured objects. And so we traded with them. By the mid-1700s, we were also trading with the British and getting all kinds of manufactured goods.
All right, thank you. And you over there?
Four-part question.
Four-part question, okay.
Do you have traditional music, traditional dances, traditional clothing, and who was your healer?
So our person asking says, do you have traditional music, traditional dances, traditional clothing, and do you have, I believe she said a healer?
A healer?
Yeah.
Okay. We don't have traditional music that is Miami, but we are, as I say, we're having people write music that's going to become traditional. There's an assumption, because so many of the Great Lakes area tribes had very similar music and dancing, there is an assumption that we would have used the same songs and the same dancing. I mentioned the stomp dance. Our traditional name for that can be translated as the Shawnee dance. So we believe it was a dance that was taught to us by the Shawnee, but again, that went to sleep. So in recent decades, the Shawnee have retaught it to us, and we have it once again, and we have Miami men who are able to lead and Miami women who are able to be shakers, the rhythm makers for that dance. So we song and dance, and what was the next one?
Traditional clothing, I believe. Traditional
clothing. So we are aware, we have images, we have pictures of traditional clothing. Probably the most traditional image is the ribbon work. It's a sewing art, and many tribes in the Great Lakes region do ribbon work. But what's unique about Miami ribbon work is that they're diamond patterns. I'm going to put, if I can put my slides back up. Do I have?
You should be able to.
Yeah.
There you go.
All right, on my slide, if you notice the pattern on the left of all my slides, that comes from a ribbon work design. And so our women would take silk ribbons that they got in trade, and they would cut and fold them and sew them in layers to create these diamond patterns. And so the ribbon work would be on the side of leggings, around the edge of a skirt or a blanket, on the flaps of our moccasins. And what's unique about this is other tribes use all kinds of designs. Miami people have only used diamond designs. So when you see these particular kinds of designs, we have many varieties of designs, but they're distinctively Miami. You will see diamond shapes in like even in Southwest tribal images, but it looks different. It looks different than Miami diamond patterns. And we've been using those diamond patterns. They were very early noted on people's tattoos. We're using diamond patterns, and on drawings on deer skin, for example, had diamond patterns. So this is an ancient design that we have used as a sewing art, and today we use them. We imprint those designs on our T-shirts. Someone put it on the back of his cell phone case. We put them on our PowerPoint slides. We use these designs in many ways. There is also regalia, and that is clothing that is specifically used for powwow dancing. And so that's not something we would wear just any time. And it's very specific, but often Miami regalia will have the diamond work, the ribbon work designs on them. And then the healer, no, we don't have that in any specific way. I mean, there may be people who we have people who are very knowledgeable about the use of plants and knowledgeable of how certain plants can be used as medicine, but nothing beyond that.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you. Unfortunately, we don't have much time for more questions, but we could be here all day asking you questions, poking your brain for stuff. So I'm going to ask you, your office is out of Fort Wayne. Do you have any contact information or resources that you would recommend people to follow up on to learn more about the Miami people?
I should have left that up. Back up. Okay, so our website, we've got a brand new website, so hopefully it'll be easier to use to find information. MiamiNation.com, very simple. Then there's this achimotatiangwe.org, which is not very simple. I suggest that if you can't write that down exactly as it is, just Google Myaamia, that's Myaamia, Myaamia Community Blog, because that's what this is. And it has a lot of information, a lot of history articles. If you're interested in our removal, we commemorated the 175th anniversary of our forced removal a couple of years ago. So there's a lot about that on there. More information about our calendar and various aspects of our culture. So that is the best place, in addition to the tribal website, to go for information.
All right, thank you. I'll give a little bit of time for people to still take pictures of that if they want. Otherwise, I want everyone to give Diane a big round of applause. Thank you for doing this for us.
Thank you.
And I hope you feel better, and maybe we'll be able to do some more programs with you in the future.
Hope so, yes.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you.